Thank you for listening to The New Evil by Dr. Gary Brucato. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel and get the book. Was no intimacy. He remained obsessed with her after she married her fiancé, Albert, even committing suicide so as not to interfere with her life with her husband. A man of scruples, in other words, who would never harm the person he loved, albeit obsessively. In the other situation, one has had a real and often intimate relationship with someone, and then, after a breakup, becomes obsessed with this former lover. Everyone knows such a person, and many a play and opera has such a story as its theme. In La Bohème, the hero, Rodolfo, falls in love with the beautiful Mimi in Act 1, and then, in Act 3, becomes obsessed and morbidly jealous to the point of forcing her to leave him. Of this type, there are those with scruples, and then there are those obsessed not only with the former lover, but also with revenge and the desire to harm the individual. Diane Schaefer, in contrast, does not fit easily into these schemata. She was engulfed in an obsessive love for a man with whom she had no connection, unlike Werther and Lotte, and knew only by reputation. Hers was not a classic de Clérambault type erotomania either, because she did not harbor the delusion that Dr. Brennan loved her secretly from afar, though he did occupy a higher social station, as in the classic description. Schaefer was a medical writer, the same age as the doctor she was pursuing. What was noteworthy was the manner in which she invaded the doctor's life, following him, insofar as she was able, wherever he went. Robert Bardo and Arthur Jackson, though both were grossly psychotic schizophrenics, did not insert themselves in the everyday lives of the women whom they obsessively loved. Diane Schaefer's mental state is not as clear-cut as theirs, and harder to assess. Her overriding wish was to be near the object of her fixation. To that end, she took pains to learn Dr. Brennan's travel schedule, the names of his wife and family members, and the times and places of his professional meetings. She left him numerous gifts and love letters and called him repeatedly, disguising her voice at times so as to get past his secretaries. On one occasion, she showed up at his apartment, dressed in nothing but a gossamer negligee .139. She tried to disrupt his marriage by also stalking his wife, and eventually made threats of violence. One of her more inventive ruses was to phone the airline carrier on which Dr. Brennan was about to fly to a meeting, telling the receptionist she was Mrs. Brennan and had changed her mind and now wanted to accompany her husband so that a seat next to him would be appreciated. Having no reason to doubt the woman, the receptionist would accommodate Mrs. Brennan, with the result that Schaefer could now sit beside her beloved the whole length of the flight. With equal adroitness, Schaefer could end up in the same taxi in which Dr. Brennan was riding. Because Schaefer could speak in a rational and coherent way, I would have to ascribe such behavior to cunning and unscrupulousness, rather than to the sheer delusory thinking of a Bardo or an Arthur Jackson. Yet she was a madwoman, in the sense of a kind of willed craziness in her behavior. It was engineered, as it were, in the service of her erotomanic fixation and superimposed upon an underlying mental illness that was primarily of the mood disorder type, specifically depressive. Added to this, Schaefer had, besides her depressive mood and narcissistic feelings of entitlement, clear-cut antisocial traits. She falsely reported Dr. Brennan as a, quote, child molester, for example, and, on another occasion, threatened to kill him, telling him, "I can't live while you are alive on this earth. I am going to kill you or kill myself. I am degraded by your being alive." 140. Needless to say, Dr. Brennan consistently rejected her advances, which he endured from 1982 through 1990, before finally documenting her deceptions and recording her phone calls. Armed with this information, Dr. Brennan was able to have her arrested for aggravated harassment, the usual legal designation for stalking, and convicted to serve 2 years in prison. Schaefer's stalking days were not over. Later, upon her release, she even pursued a judge, as well as her own attorney. .141. It must have required considerable ingenuity to keep abreast of Dr. Brennan's whereabouts, since Schaefer was operating in the pre-internet age, when privacy was still easier to safeguard, and she could not conduct a simple search for details of his private and professional life. I have had occasion to work with a woman who was obsessively in love with a man during a brief affair, and, after he broke off the relationship, obsessively preoccupied with getting back at him. Her stalking consisted of deluging her former lover with phone calls, letters, and emails. She took to sending some emails from the computers of friends so that the internet protocol addresses would be different from that of her home computer. She would also pretend to be these other people whose computers she endured from 1982 through 1990, before finally documenting her deceptions and recording her phone calls. Armed with this information, Dr. Brennan was able to have her arrested for aggravated harassment, the usual legal designation for stalking, and convicted to serve 2 years in prison. Schaefer's stalking days were not over. Later, upon her release, she even pursued a judge, as well as her own attorney. 141. It must have required considerable ingenuity to keep abreast of Dr. Brennan's whereabouts, since Schaefer was operating in the pre-internet age, when privacy was still easier to safeguard, and she could not conduct a simple search for details of his private and professional life. I have had occasion to work with a woman who was obsessively in love with a man during a brief affair, and, after he broke off the relationship, obsessively preoccupied with getting back at him. Her stalking consisted of deluging her former lover with phone calls, letters, and emails. She took to sending some emails from the computers of friends so that the internet protocol addresses would be different from that of her home computer. She would also pretend to be these other people whose computers she was using and write scurrilous letters, chiding the ex-boyfriend for treating the girl he rejected so shabbily. The woman did not tell me the truth about how often she contacted her ex. I contacted him via my computer and had him document by email each day how often she had tried to contact him by whatever means. I made a chart of all of this information, which I could then use to remind the woman how often she was actually communicating with him. I was able in this way to persuade her to stop the harassment and, as they say, move on with her life. As I think some of the vignettes about stalking demonstrate, the law has not been well equipped to deal with such cases, using measures of appropriate severity, that is, measures of the impact upon victims, which might warrant more severe sentences. Some small steps were taken, it is true, after each high-profile incident. Anti-stalking laws were put in place after the harassment endured by Dr. Orion, and, as we mentioned, access to people's addresses through the DMV was curtailed after the Rebecca Schaefer murder. Yet the brief sentences given to offenders who stalk but do not kill, their victims are often far too lenient, not taking into consideration how resistant to treatment stalkers of such severity typically are. In the case of Diane Schaefer, she was, after all, trying by ever more aggressive steps to ruin Dr. Brennan's life and, perhaps, ultimately kill either him or his wife. The situation is analogous to certain cases of attempted murder. Because the victim has survived, the law often hands down a sentence that is considerably less severe than might have been given in the case of the victim's death. Often, the individual's survival in an attempted murder is merely the result of some miracle of modern medicine, not available 20 years before, or a bullet fired by the perpetrator that shifts a few millimeters to the left or the right of the femoral artery or the aorta or the heart, so that the victim does not bleed out or die. Yet, if it is demonstrably clear that the intention of the perpetrator was to kill, then the difference with respect to the severity of the crime between murder and attempted murder is academic. The length of the sentence should not vary by much, since the level of the criminal's dangerousness was the same. A stalker who disrupts the daily life and the tranquility of a victim as severely as some of the people we have discussed here should, I believe, be considered highly dangerous and given a sentence in accordance with that level of dangerousness. With forensic experts, best estimates of the likelihood for a repetition of the stalking behavior. In England, there are some felons, for example, whose sentences consist of being released at the Queen's pleasure. That is, when competent authorities in the penal system have, upon re-examination, concluded that the felon in question can be trusted not to reoffend. That could vary from a short time to a long stretch, or even forever, depending upon the stalker's capacity or lack thereof for genuine remorse and rehabilitation. Some stalkers, when defending their actions in the courtroom, invoke external forces, saying things like, "I don't know what possessed me to do the things I did." Yet, such words may come more from the tongue than the heart. Even such phraseology is worrisome. "What possessed me" suggests the wish to convey that such behavior was influenced by some force, the devil or an evil spirit, that took over their brains from the outside, and thus they were not responsible. After release, such persons generally go on stalking, as we have already noted. Nothing changes. The Queen would not have been pleased. As the preceding vignettes have shown, the term obsessive love is used in a variety of clinically different situations. The categories depicted here do not quite do justice to the 50 shades of gray that populate the region between the extremities, that is, stalking versus no stalking, psychosis versus no psychosis. Diane Schaefer is a good example of the complexity in any discussion of obsessive love. The seriousness of her depression was great enough to suggest a, quote, depressive psychosis, but the outward manifestations of this condition consisted of outrageous behaviors, more than the primarily cognitive distortions and delusions of the more commonly encountered depressive psychosis. An example of the latter would be a woman, recently divorced, who was admitted to a psychiatric hospital some years ago, suffering from the delusion that her husband was causing rays to pass from his house to the house where she was now living, rays that were exerting an injurious effect on her brain. Her delusion, we can understand, was the concretization of her sadness and sense of despair and bewilderment over being rejected by her husband. Schaefer was in her early 40s and alone. Perhaps that was the crisis that mobilized her mad behavior. Yet, her cruel and persistent stalking meant that her depression was overshadowed by the severity of her personality disorder, which contained narcissistic, paranoid, borderline, and also psychopathic features. As with many white-collar psychopaths, Schaefer showed mostly the narcissistic traits, such as pathological lying, manipulativeness, callousness, failure to accept responsibility for one's behavior, and lack of genuine remorse, rather than the criminological ones. Arrests for many different types of crime, and so forth. Furthermore, her cognitive impairment was not as severe as that of the divorced woman disturbed by the rays. I hope the vignettes on obsessive love included here, especially that of Schaefer, demonstrate how such persons are resistant to the interventions of psychiatry, often to the point of being altogether untreatable. The persons we have discussed here, exemplifying obsessive love combined with stalking, represent a comparatively new form of psychopathology. The famous cases came mostly from the 1980s, well into the era of New Evil. These individuals exhibited a narcissism of unbridled entitlement, in which relentless pursuit, injurious always and at times fatal, was carried out without the merest scintilla of compunction or restraint. Diane Schaefer and Richard Farley represent the extreme end of this spectrum, thanks to the sheer inventiveness of their maneuvers and their years-long dedication to their morbid art. Farley was a few months shy of 40 when he killed the 7 workers at his old firm and fired bullets into Laura Black. Schaefer was in her 40s in the early period of her stalking Dr. Brennan. The prior lives of both were devoid of successful intimate relationships. Socially, they were loners, unsuccessful at love. Perhaps the approach of middle age, with no history of romantic successes, contributed to the now or never desperation that drove these two to their stalking. That cannot be the whole story, since there are many people in similar circumstances who never engage in such intrusive, let alone dangerous behaviors. We can barely diagnose them, we cannot explain them fully. The French have a better word for their behavior: monomany, implying a delusional preoccupation that is strictly limited to a small territory on the psychic map. In essence, a monomania, with the rest of one's mental function remaining free of psychotic distortions. We end this discussion of stalking with a description of the only other patient I have ever encountered who displayed the de Clerambault type of stalking behavior, a 50-year-old divorced physician with one adult child. The latter lived in a different country. For reasons of confidentiality, I have changed relevant names and places. Ingrid, as I shall call her, came from Austria, and in her post-divorce loneliness, she developed a delusional preoccupation with a famous opera baritone. Unlike the classic de Clerambault patient, she was well-to-do and of the same social class as the object of her erotomanic love, though his fame still put him a notch above her socially. She would buy a ticket to whatever opera the famous baritone appeared in, traveling to whatever country he would sing in, Germany, France, Italy, England, the United States, and so on. It was her conviction that her great Bewunderung, admiration for him, coupled with the spirit in her brain, would leap out of her head and instill itself in the baritone's head, enabling him to sing more wonderfully than he could without this invisible transmission from Ingrid, who was somewhere in the audience. She was also convinced that he appreciated her gift and loved her as keenly as she loved him. In her imagination, however, he was not at liberty to show this affection because of his wife's jealousy. Worse yet, Ingrid believed she was being followed by German-speaking people hired by the wife to protect her turf and make sure Ingrid made no trouble for their marriage. Ingrid never approached the baritone, so that, although she followed him, the first half of stalking, she never invaded his privacy. Her delusion had another key feature. If, perchance, while at home she saw a man standing 100 yards away from her kitchen window, she assumed it was the baritone, trying as best he could to signal his love to her, which he dared not do any more openly because of his wife's consuming jealousy. In a way, her erotomanic delusion was quite satisfying. She was not exactly with the great baritone, but she was not entirely alone either. In her mind, they were ill-fated lovers, destined to share an intimacy only of the spirit, rather than of the body. I wondered what prompted her to seek treatment. The reason had to do with the more paranoid part of her delusion, those German hirelings who made sure she never got all that close to her beloved. If I could do something to shoo them away, perhaps she could get close to the baritone after all. She pictured his marriage as shaky. She was not far off the mark. A year after I began working with her, the baritone did divorce. Yet, she still never approached him. I had occasion to approach him years later when he sang at the Metropolitan. After the performance, I told him about this woman who felt her spirit leaped into his head, enabling him to do his best. He smiled and said that, as he had no way of knowing how he sang when she was not in the audience, since she always was, he hoped she continued. What if having such a loyal fan was a help after all? Ingrid was, of course, different from the types of stalkers we have delineated here. There was none of the new narcissism or new evil. She was a sweet, sad, and lonely woman whose only possibly narcissistic trait was a grandiose assumption that her secret love of the baritone was the key to his enormous success. With depressing regularity, but at intervals that are, of course, not equally spaced, we are electrified by the news of yet another school shooting. Because these shootings occur every so often, but not on schedule, we are taken by surprise each time. This intensifies our shock and horror over yet another atrocity, another evil. School shootings are a particular species within the genus of mass murder. To our discomfiture and our discredit, America outpaces other countries, not by metaphorical yards or furlongs, but by leagues. We are in a different league, chalking up these atrocities over other countries by a factor of approximately 50. I maintain a spreadsheet of mass murderers who have garnered high degrees of attention in the press, ranging from 1857 through the time of this writing in May of 2018. Currently, these number 333. Among mass murders of all types, the school shooters number 22, or 6.6% of the total. These are about evenly distributed, with 12 in the United States and 10 in 7 other countries. Among mass murderers of whatever type, my file contains only one example from some 13 nations. I note larger numbers from a few countries, 12 in Canada, 6 each in Germany, China, and New Zealand, 5 in France, and 4 each in England and Sweden. By no means does this give an accurate picture of worldwide mass murder going back to the beginning of the 20th century, since some cases have occurred, albeit rarely, in more obscure countries. Moreover, large numbers of mass murders occur in the United States that receive little attention in the press or involve fewer than the 3 cases the FBI has required since 2013, or the 4 previously needed before an attack meets an arbitrary standard. Sometimes the victim count is less because of, fortunately, poor marksmanship or some other failure on the part of the killer. The latter was the case with one of the few females among the school shooters, Lori Wasserman Dan, who, in a Chicago suburb, shot at a group of kindergarten children, wounding 5 but killing only 1 before committing suicide. 1. As previously noted, mass murderers who include school shooters within their ranks are overwhelmingly male, accounting for about 97%. 2. Throughout 2018, a number of articles about school shooters sprung up rapidly in the aftermath of the high school rampage in Park. It is alleged that using a recently purchased and easily accessible semi-automatic rifle, an AR-15, added to his already large collection of at least 10 rifles and shotguns, he killed 17 students before he was finally captured by the police. The captured by the police part of the story is the most unusual feature, since the majority of mass murderers, including school shooters, commit suicide as the police close in or are killed by the police, in what is sometimes called suicide by cop. Few survive to tell their stories. If these accusations were confirmed, it would appear Cruz chose Valentine's Day as a kind of jealousy-prompted revenge for having been rejected by a girlfriend at the school some months before, when she switched her affections, understandably enough, as it turns out, to another boy. According to published reports, Cruz had earlier been treated for depression and had cut himself and attempted suicide by drinking gasoline. 3. He was thought to have been affected with the fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, by a presumably alcoholic mother who had given him up for adoption. 4. If this allegation proves accurate, it may be that FAS was a contributing factor to the unleashing of violence Cruz reportedly committed that day. The disorder has been in the background of a number of other prominent murder cases as predisposing to poor impulse control and to outbursts of violence. 5. If, indeed present, FAS may also have contributed to Cruz's suicidal ideation and attempts, given the high proportion of persons with the syndrome who a. die at an average of only 34, and b. whose deaths are caused by suicide in 15% of cases, according to recent research by Dr. Carl Bell. 6. The focus in this chapter is on school shooters whose acts took place in elementary school through high school. Many compilations in the literature include shootings in colleges as well. Granted that massacres are tragedies, irrespective of locale or of the victims targeted, there is something particularly heart-wrenching about the slaughter en masse of younger children. This is why the 2012 murder of 20 kindergartners in Newtown, Connecticut 7 had, perhaps, an even more devastating impact on the public than the murder 5 years earlier of 32 students and teachers at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, 8 commonly called Virginia Tech. Both of these massacres were carried out by severely autistic men in their early 20s, Adam Lanza in Newtown and Sung-Hui Cho in Virginia, which, as noted earlier, subsequently surrounded autistic persons with undeserved stigma, since they are less prone to violence than are groups of individuals with certain psychiatric disorders. As it turns out, school shootings of either type deserve a place in a book concentrating on forms of evil that have manifested themselves with special force in the last half-century. School shootings, for example, have been scrupulously recorded and documented since the beginning of the 19th century. The same is true for mass murders in general. We have created 3 relevant graphs. 1. Showing the growth by decade of the population in the United States between 1840 and May of 2018, again the time of this writing. Another showing the number of school shootings involving any number of casualties during the same period, and a third showing the number of deaths inflicted by these shootings. The graphs show the smooth, gradual increase in the American population over the last 188 years. In contrast to the number of school shootings and the number of victims, both of which show a dramatic increase since the 1960s. For the most part, the school shootings in America throughout the 19th and into the first half of the 20th centuries were highly personal affairs. Deaths and injuries were limited to one, or perhaps two or three persons. The participants knew one another. What precipitated the violence was usually an argument, a sense of outrage over an injustice, or a triangle of jealousy in which one boy killed another over a girl. Of the 7 deadly sins enunciated in the year 590 by Pope Gregory I, namely pride, envy, greed, sloth, lust, anger, and gluttony, our ancestors who perpetrated school shootings were motivated largely by anger, pride, and envy. The examples seem almost quaint compared with what we are witnessing in the current era. One can often sympathize with the actors in these small-scale dramas. In one early example, dating to 1856, a schoolmaster in Florence, Alabama had a pet sparrow and warned his pupils not to harm it, or else he would murder whoever did it. One of the boys stepped on the bird and killed it. The schoolmaster shortly thereafter strangled the boy to death as he had promised. The boy's father then went to the school and shot the schoolmaster to death. Point 9. In a similar example, also prompted by the urge to avenge an injustice, a Mr. McGinnis was the father of a girl who had been expelled from school by her teacher. This was in Knight's Ferry, a small gold rush town in central California, founded in 1848 by a Dr. William Knight, who had been murdered the very next year. When, in 1867, the father went to his daughter's school to complain, the teacher shot him to death. Once the victim's son learned of this, he went to the school and shot the teacher to death, avenging the murder of his father via what, in the laws of that time, might have been viewed in the gray zone of homicide as a kind of vigilante justice. 10. A few years later, another school shooting took place, this time with a more contemporary quality, centered on anger in a disobedient and perhaps antisocial pupil who got even when punished by his teacher. A 20-year-old Thomas Squires from the small town of Agency, Montana, near the Crow Indian Reservation, fatally shot his teacher, Mr. Hayes, following ejection from the school. Shades of the rampage allegedly committed by Nicholas Cruz, except that Cruz, having been expelled the year before, might have intended to kill everybody there. Not only a teacher. 11 Jealousy was behind the 1904 Chicago murder of one teenage student by another. 2 16-year-olds had been fighting for months over a girl. The rivalry ended when Henry Shays pushed Paul Gillick to the ground and then shot him to death with a revolver. 12. Even throughout the first 2/3 of the 20th century, school shootings involved only a very small number of deaths and were generally confined to situations in which the participants knew one another and in which the perpetrator had been nurturing a grudge of some sort against the victim. The first large-scale incident of a shooter killing many, as opposed to one or two persons, and at random not knowing any of the victims personally, was that of Charles Whitman, an engineering student at the University of Texas, in August of 1966. Yet, that was a college shooting, not a primary school affair. Besides having first stabbed to death his mother and wife, Whitman fatally shot 3 people in a tower on the university's campus. Then, for approximately 96 minutes, he randomly fired at students on the ground from an observation deck on the tower's 28th floor. There were 11 additional deaths, which included an unborn child, and 31 others were wounded before Whitman was killed by police. 13. Looking back, we can see this incident as the inauguration, so to speak, of the massacres of random persons by a shooter, more often a college rather than a high school student, using a semi-automatic weapon. Although primary school shootings greatly outnumber those associated with colleges, as is noted in the larger compilations of such data, 14 statistics on both are remarkably similar, showing dramatic and abrupt increases beginning in the late 1970s and surging upward since 1980. In either setting, the readily available and easily acquired semi-automatic pistols and rifles that became available increasingly in the late 1960s and early 1970s have played a major role in these shootings, especially in the large-scale massacres. This is by now a commonly held view, as echoed in the remark of a journalist. Not surprisingly, given the ready availability of firearms in the United States, the phenomenon of school shootings is overwhelmingly American. 15. Furthermore, it is not just any American students perpetrating school shootings. The great majority are American white male teenagers, most of whom, as author Justin Peters pointed out, had studied the Columbine Massacre of April 1999, deriving inspiration, if that is an acceptable term, or at least, a morbid kind of justification from the comments of the two perpetrators, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Thank you for listening to The New Evil by Dr. Gary Brucato. Please subscribe to his YouTube channel and get the book. Thank you for listening to The New Evil by Dr. Gary Brucato. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter in the understanding of evil as it progressions in gradations. This is 12 Gauge from 12 Gauge Investigative. Be safe and watch your 6.